Hi, everyone. Welcome to the AI Lab podcast. Today, I have Nelson with me, who's our guest today, and we're going to engage in a very fascinating discussion, I think, around, I hope, around AI and learning and development, learning management systems. And I'll hand it over first, of course, to Nelson to introduce himself. So, yeah, go for it, Nelson.
Josh, thanks for having me on the show. I'm one of the founders and CEO at HowNow. We're a learning platform used by some of the largest organizations in the world. They use us to identify what the skills gaps are in the organization and connect those gaps to relevant learning so they can build the skills they need and grow as an organization and support individuals in the business. Prior to that, my background has just been in tech, a tech entrepreneur. Trying to solve different problems in the world through tech. I'm also the author of a book called Learning at Speed, which essentially adapts mental models and frameworks from the startup world to use within the domain of L&D. So organizations can accelerate their speed of learning in the same way a startup would. So great to be on the show.
Great stuff. I think you did touch on it a little, but I was hoping you could just expand on sort of the inspiration or drive behind this initiative of HowNow, and what was the sort of seed behind that in your mind and among your partners?
Yeah, sure. So I guess it kind of came from Josh and my kind of previous business. It spent a few years. It was a video advertising tech business. We sold that business. And after that, we were at a place where whatever we wanted to do next needed to be, we felt like a kind of meaningful problem that you wanted to spend the next few years trying to solve. And even if you didn't solve, it seemed like a good use of time trying to solve a big problem. And at that time, much like it is today, one of the big problems is the skills gap, right? The growing skills gap crisis that we're seeing globally. And even kind of 5+ years ago, everyone recognized that this was a problem. Essentially, if people don't have the skills to be able to do the relevant jobs, what we're going to end up with is a lot of people being socially and economically irrelevant. And if you think that sounds like a big problem, it is. And that's the reason why governments around the world were starting to look at kind of dedicated skills strategy. In some governments at the time, for example, Singapore had allocated skills subsidy. And so we could see that this was going to be a big problem. And at that time, we thought whoever solves this problem, right, is going to build a very big and important company. And an important company of our time. And we thought, you know what, let's give it a go, right? Let's look at how you can try solving this problem of making sure people are building the skills that matter. And kind of that's really where it stemmed from. It's how can we make sure you can empower people with the right knowledge and skills and mindset so they can go and solve some of the biggest problems in the world, right? And it really kind of stems from that. And how do you do that from kind of shaping what they're learning? And that's really where the spark came from, Josh. It was, can we solve this big problem that many people are trying to tackle and build an important company of our time?
Makes sense. Yeah, no, that definitely makes sense. And how have you come to contrast yourselves from sort of the traditional, the sort of traditional L&D competitors? What's the sort of major differentiator that you've sort of come upon?
Yeah, I think it kind of stems from, if you look at the kind of predominant product category in this space, as you said earlier, it's the learning management system, what your LMSs. And if you look at the LMSs, they were built very much for what we would call it a content first world, right? The approach is very much around, answering the question of what content do people need and how am I going to get that content to them? So they were really kind of designed around the principles of content storage, content distribution, and even the reporting is from the perspective of reporting on content metrics. How much time did people spend on this? Did they complete it or not? But that's not the problem we're trying to solve. And I think we reframe the problem. The problem here isn't about content, but the problem is a lot more of a macro problem. It's about, do you have the skills you need to be successful at what you do? And if you don't, how are you going to get those skills? And what are those skills that you need? And how are we going to help you develop those skills? And if you look at those, they're very different questions to what the LMS is trying to answer, which is very content first. And so we kind of approach this more from what we would call a skills first approach, right? and really trying to figure out, okay, how can you use technology to identify what skills you should have, and then figuring out what skills you do have, and then using technology to bridge those gaps to help you build the skills you need. And that's where HowNow we come into a space with a very different approach, which is around, okay, how do you now create a learning platform that's really about helping you build the skills you need? And that takes a very different approach. So typically we're replacing your kind of traditional legacy LMSs that take a very content-centric approach, and skills is a lot more of a business-wide conversation, right? It's a common language that the entire organization understands. Your C-suite understands skills. Every employee understands skills. However, traditional L&D has been kind of held back by using very L&D language. The reality is the C-suite doesn't care how many courses you've completed, right? Your employees don't care how many courses or how much time they spent on it. And so we're helping reframe learning and development at a more business-wide level by using skills as the common language that people understand.
Nelson, I think it's absolutely fascinating, and I think it's a fantastic approach. I've got as you talk, I have sort of a scenario develop in my head, and I suppose the analogy is one where you sort of look at skills forecasting at a macro level. Even if you think of that as like a governmental problem, and we'll sort of get into this landscape in a second. But one of the things that strikes me so much is the extent to which it's become much more opaque to understand what the matching kind of labor requirements will be in the future than it's sort of ever been before. I could imagine that the challenge of kind of doing skills-based forecasting from an immigration perspective, or even just from a national government planning perspective, was simpler when you sort of thought you needed to have X number of teachers and X number of plumbers and doctors and whatever else, and then you sort of backfill that into programs that capacitate. But one thing that seems to be common cause now is that the rate of change is just so much more rapid, and the application of knowledge into domains of performance is becoming almost like harder to get your hands around. Like we just sort of don't know, this disruptive landscape with large language models and, sort of potentially the advent of like super productive workforces and things. How do you, what do you think of that? Like, how do you think about the rate of change sort of speeding up? And, that obviously at one level happens at a country level or global level, but it also happens in the workplace. The worker today not embracing Copilot in software dev, or, might be extinct very soon. And there's a time to learn, which is almost a hard constraint. Unfortunately, we can't upload skills into our brains through a USB stick just yet. Yet the landscape is evolving so quickly. So just what are your thoughts about that? The rate of change sort of quickening.
Yeah. Absolutely right. The rate of change, without a doubt, is exponential. We're living in an era of exponential change. And I think the challenge you sometimes have is humans have a history of underestimating what exponential change means. I mean, a good example of that is when COVID first broke out and people said, you should start wearing masks, you should stay in because actually this is going to spread exponentially. Most of us underestimated it. Right. Another example of it is compound interest. People often underestimate how quickly compound interest can build up. And so we have a history of underestimating exponential change. And hence the reason why often we're slow to react and change to this. And that we've seen now at the rate of change getting faster, how detrimental it is to businesses who once we thought were strong incumbents who would never be phased. Actually, we're now starting to see new winners and losers. So what happens with change is exponential change brings about new opportunities and threats, right? And the fastest learners are able to capitalize on those opportunities and win. And those who can't learn fast enough essentially fall behind and they lose. And what does losing mean in this context? Well, it means in the worst case, companies going bankrupt, and we've seen many of those happen with big brands. And for an individual, going back to what I mentioned earlier, it means you now become socially and economically irrelevant. Now, what does that mean? It means you're now struggling to get a job. You're now struggling to keep up the lifestyle that you have. It's difficult to maintain relationships, and all of that unravels. So what does that mean for us? It means actually the only sustainable competitive advantage an organization can build is our ability to learn at speed. That's the only thing that matters. The days of cheaper products, innovative products, having better people, all of those advantages just don't last long enough, right? You can no longer win just on price, because someone else will come in and do it because of the rate of change. And so the only real sustainable competitive advantage is your organization able to continuously learn and reinvent itself and apply what it learns quick enough. And if you don't have that capability within your organization, or you're not investing in building that capability within your organization, you're just not going to be able to win in this era of exponential change.
I think that's fascinating, and definitely we are not wired to understand logarithmic growth. It's not something we get. We think it's straight lines. I'm interested to know how you see the adoption of that culturally in an organization. So, these things are always part solved by technology. So using smart techs that kind of codify learnings that we've had around how people can learn and how they're incentivized to learn. But, big businesses of knowledge workers are typically very busy. They're very busy doing things the way that they always used to do them. And we even see that in our organization to an extent. You can have the brightest teams in machine learning, data analytics, not embracing new tooling, because you kind of have organizational structures and measurements that keep them doing what they're doing, kind of that corporate inertia. So how do you think in your business about kind of breaking down those barriers to ensure that people do learn faster? I mean, it's obviously not just tech. There's kind of the agility mindset and stuff. How do you tackle that challenge?
Absolutely. So it starts first with a mindset shift, right? And this is what I write about in my book, Learning at Speed, and I call it lean learning. But it's really the idea of how do you build the skills that matter in the shortest time, right? That's what we're all trying to do, because none of us have the time to be learning for the sake of learning per se, right? And we definitely don't have the time to be learning irrelevant things that the business for some reason is pushing to me on a one-size-fits-all approach. I haven't got time for that. And this lack of time is a common, I think LinkedIn for the last 3 years in their research have found lack of time is the most common quoted reason by employees for not learning. And I often say what they mean when they say lack of time is they don't have time to be learning things that they don't understand are important to them. So what the employee needs to know is, what's in it for me? Why does this thing matter, and why should I be learning? And often it's that context that we ignore, right? It's not good enough to say, you got to learn this. I need to know why. What's in it for me, and where is it going to take me? And I think it's that shift to really help me understand why building these skills is a critical piece for me to be successful at what I do. And I think that's a kind of mindset shift, especially in organizational L&D, right? Organizational L&D has historically very much been top down, one size fits all. And it's not very problem focused, right? It's not very much around kind of, this is the business problem we're trying to solve. And in order to solve this problem, we need these skills. And in order to build these skills, we need to be learning ABC to get to that point. And the reality is we all learn, right? We're all learning. Like, even the people you mentioned, Tim, the chances are they are probably listening to podcasts, reading blogs. It's just they don't learn in the way we've traditionally associated learning at work, which is going away to a 2-day conference or joining a classroom course. And they are making time for that in that moment of need. And that's the critical piece. We're motivated the most in those moments of need. And the best example of this is Google, right? To demonstrate this behavior is, in our moment of need, we would go to Google and search for something. We're more likely to engage with what we find. We're more likely to apply what we find because we're in that moment of need. And because we're applying what we find, we're more likely to create a positive feedback loop, because I'm able to see the results of applying that thing within my moment of need. And that keeps me coming back. Now, within organizational L&D, we don't create the opportunity to create that positive feedback loop because we don't deliver learning at the moment of need. What we're doing in traditional L&D is essentially we're teaching someone how to do a VLOOKUP in Excel 6 months before they've ever logged into Excel, right? And that's where we come down to the Copilot. The reason why the Copilot and any variation of that, it's such a compelling disruption to L&D, is because the Copilot is able to deliver the relevant knowledge and learning in that moment of need where I'm most motivated to engage and apply it. And so I think it's a combination of that mindset and cultural shift to recognize that we need to be learning at speed. If not, we're going to fall behind. but then making sure we have both the strategy and technology to enable that capability to learn at speed.
So, I mean, you've said a lot there, and each one of those you can double click on and have a long conversation on. But the idea of job leveling and job architecture frameworks in organizations is probably more of a typical approach. So you'd say to progress through your career, you need to apply these particular skills so that when we go and engage with the customer let's take it in any one of the scarce skills domains, we can assure our customer that the candidate has got like the requisite skills to perform the tasks. How do you kind of marry these two concepts together of like in moment or at the moment of need learning with kind of warrantying that the candidates that you're working with in particular domains are actually, sufficiently adroit in those domains? I suppose that would be sort of the first question. And then I'm also very interested to understand where you found success and leverage kind of engaging with C-suites. So it's a very typical, traditional approach, again, because it's really easy to measure. I move through these different career stagings, I get these certifications, and that gives me like a promotional step. Do you sort of see that deconstructing into kind of like a library of, I want to call them micro learning components kind of deployed at need? Or how do the two marry up? Or is the organizational shift and endorsement from the C-suite enough to kind of get you there? So sorry, that was quite dense. I suppose the first just being where do we get left with job architectures and job leveling? And then how do you get the C-suite to engage and make that happen in an organization?
I think the first shift there, Tim, is we need to start looking at our talent and organization through the lens of skills, right? Because the static job functions are limiting for essentially tapping into the talent we have in our organization. Also, it is limiting for increasing your speed of learning in an organization, because you're limiting what that person learns based on this static job function, because you're saying this is relevant, this isn't relevant, versus looking at what is the business trying to achieve, what's the problems you're trying to solve. And really what we want to know is, do we have the skills and the mastery within the organization to do it? And that brings about our first problem, right? If you look at how many companies track skills proficiency as a KPI in the same way they track any other KPI, they don't, right? And so we're all trying to upskill and reskill, but you can't upskill and reskill without actually knowing what skills you have and don't have in the first place. It's kind of the first place where you need to start. And this is where AI plays a big role, and we help organizations break down and understand their company from the skills perspective. Because if we break down this problem, the first question is, how do I know what skills each individual should have? That's the first problem we need to solve for. So how we look at that is essentially we look at a large language model based on real-time job market data to look at the market data and identify what are the most in-demand skills for any particular job, right? So if my job was an L&D manager, we'd be able to look at real-time market data and say, these are the skills the market says you should have, right? That's the first part. The second part is based on your work history of what work you've done. We make an inference using AI to go, well, based on what you've done, we can infer that these are the skills that you may have, right? Based on that. So we now combine the market data with your internal talent history data to now form a mapping of these are the skills that we think each individual in your company has. That's the first step. It's to know, it's to now we're shifting the way you look at each individual in your business, because you're looking at them through the lens of skills. But that doesn't tell us to what level of mastery or proficiency they have that skill. And this is where what we do is we use essentially a very simple 360 feedback mechanism to assess what level of proficiency you have. Now, at this point, there's two ways you could do it. You can either do the objective approach, which is I give you an assessment, Tim, and based on how you perform in that assessment, I say you're skill level 4. Now, we don't believe in that approach because it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. Just because you're able to ace an exam doesn't make you great at your job, right? It doesn't mean you're able to apply that knowledge within a relevant work context. We take a more subjective route where we believe the best people to evidence whether you're applying the skills that you've acquired within a work context are the people you work with, right? Your manager, your peers, and also a self-assessment. Now, we combine that 360 assessment with the AI-powered mapping that we've generated to now give you a numerical value for every skill every individual in your organization has. Now we can have a C-suite conversation where we could say, look, this is the OKR or business goal you're trying to drive, right? You're trying to, at IQ Business, you're trying to grow service line X, right? And now you're able to look at your skills in your organization and go, actually, with gaps X, Y, Z, we don't have the skills to be able to achieve that goal. Now we can have a conversation around, okay, what do we need to do to build those skills? And that's where learning comes in, Tim. And I think the traditional L&D approach is often looked at learning as the end goal, completing learning as the end goal. But actually, if we look at it through the lens of a job to be done, learning is the product I'm hiring to get a job done. And in this case, the job to be done is, it could be growing this service line, right? That's the job to be done. And I'm hiring learning to help me build the skills gap that I've identified. And so that's the conversation we have. And I think that's the biggest shift we're seeing in learning and development, right? It's no longer just seen as L&D as a function that looks after compliance, right? Historically, to now we're actually having a C-suite conversation about skills, right? Because that's what the C-suite cares about. And especially given the tight labor market, right? I think that's what's really fueling it in the current environment, is the tight labor market means it's now more expensive to buy and borrow the skills that you need. And so you're having to build those skills. And because change is exponential, it's just not sustainable to keep buying skills every time you need them. You have to have the capability to build them internally.
This is the part of conversation where I really get excited when I start to hear about the application of AI in these different domains. And as you're talking again, we do something in parallel to what you're doing around using large language models to screen talent and match into job specifications. So the idea is that you have a look at conformity between what somebody's done through passing through natural language, a portfolio of evidence of sorts, and then match it up with an AI synthesized job specification, which can also be the sum of numerous successful candidates' portfolio of evidence. So you kind of summarize the two together and then look at the conformity, and you can use that for shortlisting candidates. As you were talking about 360s, I thought back on my days, we many years ago, in fact, Josh and I were doing it, built an enterprise feedback management software platform, an enterprise platform. One of the things I suppose we try to do more and more as we harness tech is to try to take out the systemic inertia of like engaging with lots of people. I try to take away the friction of asking people to fill out surveys and evaluations and all that goes with that. Have you considered taking this idea of using bigger corpuses, or corpi, whatever the plural is, of evidence of people's performance as the way that you assess skills, rather than trying to get feedback from almost like a 360 perspective? I mean, I agree with you, performance is relative, so you need to understand what that looks like in the organization from the people you work with. But what about other unstructured data sources, things like meeting minutes with colleagues, video interviews? We've been doing some stuff now, passing through video content, text, video to text, emotion detection, sentiment analysis, all those kind of classic things. You can see a future not far from here where you may not need 360. You may just be able to harness all of these artifacts that exist and do automated skills assessment. Yeah,
absolutely. And this is where we are now, right? We're actually in the process of beta trying this out right now, where essentially a large part of what we do is we integrate into your internal systems, right? That's everything from your HR system to your productivity systems. It could be your teams, your CRM, your help desk. What that gives us insight into is performance data, right? Is, if your average sales cycle is 6 months and you've got a segment of your salespeople who are typically over that, we're able to identify who those people are and then essentially look at the skills that they should have. And then think, so in terms of tying it back to, absolutely, I think the one we can see in clear sight is we would be able to put a skills proficiency level based on performance data that we're getting out of your productivity systems. We're definitely not far away from that now. But it's taking that a step further, and where we're looking at it is, okay, I've identified this person is underperforming against the benchmark. Now the question is, out of your learning ecosystem or your knowledge ecosystem within your organization, is can I precisely find, and that's the key bit here, is the precision, about learning, right? We're historically, when we've spoken about adaptive or personalized learning, we're still saying, I'm going to find the right course for you. But this is not about a course. This is not about me going on another program. It's about working out exactly what is the right amount of knowledge and what do I need to solve the problem at hand that I've identified. And that problem is a performance problem, right? It's being able to look at, okay, if this salesperson is taking 3 months longer to typically close a deal compared to the benchmark in that team, now I need to be able to drill down to go, okay, what is it that this person's failing to do that's resulting in them taking longer to close a deal? And to be able to identify that problem, then find precisely the bit of learning or knowledge that's going to help them solve that problem, right? So that's where we're excited is with the models getting bigger and our ability to string along a sequence of actions getting more possible with AI. We can now do the end-to-end value chain here, right? It's not just I identified the problem and I stop. Now what we're able to do is identify the performance problem, find the precise bit of learning, connect it with you in that moment of need to make sure we're driving behavior change. And I think that's exciting, is to be able to map that end to end and kind of deliver the real value through behavior change in learning. And that's what we're excited about now is looking at the performance data. Where can we take this?
It's tremendously exciting. And I think we can all see this unbelievable future where it almost feels like anything is possible. We're sort of at on the first step on the ramp up to this just exponential release of capability from all of these kind of co-pilots. I've got one more question just on the kind of positive side, and then I think we should turn the conversation to some of the risks and some of the things that may, AI gone wrong, and because I think these are also really important lessons for our listeners to hear. But as you're talking about this idea of curating just the right knowledge for the participant that needs it in the moment, so this idea of giving them just what they need, started to think about learning styles. I mean, to what extent is that something to consider as well? Like, at its most basic, some people are more visual, some people are more auditory, some people are more tactile. People have got very different ways of learning. Some are like really book smart, some are much better at practical assessments. Do you think that in the future roadmap here, almost like a multimodal approach to the dissemination of the curated piece of knowledge that a customer needs to learn, or an employee or learner in an organization, or even not in an organization, perhaps an institution or something else like that? I mean, do you apply much thinking to that, like multimodal and trained machine learning, trained learning models, one-to-one, micro sort of segments, personalized, hyper-personalized, not only in content but also in modality?
Yeah, so I think the first thing there is statistically no significant scientific evidence to support learning styles, right? There's been a ton of research to be done. This idea that we have one preference of, we're a visual learner, auditory learning, there is actually no significant scientific research. I've also written about this in my book. What dictates what we prefer is that moment of need, is the context of that need. If I'm on a commute, on a train, and I want to learn something, maybe listening to something is going to be better. I'm going to listen to a podcast. When I'm in the gym, I'm going to listen to a podcast. Maybe in a different environment, if I work in a place where it's typically quite dark, maybe video content is not going to be the best one to it. So what dictates it is the other factors that determine that moment and need. But there's no significant evidence around learning styles. Now, that said, the multimodal approach, absolutely. The whole one part of connecting, quite simply, what we're trying to do is, can we connect the right learning to the right person at the right time? A big part of determining and driving that right time is understanding that context and what modal, right, is going to be the right fit for the context of where this person is, right? So, going back to so we have 15 operating principles for what we define as the how and now of AI for L&D, right? And more than happy to kind of share this, but one of those is the best search is no search, right? And that's where AI can take us. So to picture what that looks like is, if I have all of this data about your context, your performance, and what you're working on today, I can proactively nudge you with what I think is relevant learning based on your context. And that could be based on your context. Is it something I think you can read right now? Is it something I think you can listen right now? Is it a combination of those multiple factors? So it'll be one of the parameters you take into account to essentially be able to nudge that person with relevant learning they would be able to experience in that moment of need, and therefore engage and apply and shape their behavior. So absolutely, modality will be one of the parameters which you'll be considering in trying to connect the right learning to the right person at the right time.
That's fascinating. I didn't know that. I feel I've been educated. Thank you.
A question from my side. So, I mean, we've touched on a lot of the sort of positive potential for AI, some realized, some quite near in the future to be realized, such as personalized learning, auto assessments, personalized feedback, something that we are also working in the lab, as are many AI teams at the moment. That is sort of the idea of retrieval augmented generation, sort of the ability to ask questions over policy documents, over learning material. And I think that's another sort of great potential for AI to really enhance the sort of learning experience and improve learner engagements. But I want to talk a bit about potential challenges. And so a little bit of sort of a small context, or a little bit of a backstory to further illustrate this point. A few years ago, when I was sort of building machine learning models at an insurer, one of the sort of prerequisites for some of the projects was the ability to build a neural network from scratch within some appropriate Python framework. And of course, one had sort of Stack Overflow, we had books, we had each other's codes. The world, it wasn't just a complete island of development. It was a very interesting journey. But I take a look at now what's possible with LLMs and co-pilots, where the need isn't anymore the ability to write such code from scratch. It's about asking the right questions about information in the right way, because LLMs can essentially, with the right prompt, with the right instruction, write the code from scratch for you. You can even, to a very degree of sophistication, test that code and debug it and help you to deploy it. So I wanted to ask a little bit about, perhaps a question of framing, because I mean, this isn't a challenge in itself. I think it's an advantage, but I mean, with the proliferation of these tools and sort of the coming wave, I think in the next 6 months, I think we're going to see a massive explosion in co-pilots and from different, not just from Microsoft, but from different industries and agents, personal assistants. The question of, and maybe it's a naive question, but how does one get an honest assessment of an individual's skills or knowledge? And what is honest in this context? Because with LLMs, one could, you know what I mean, with the right prompt, gain some information that you didn't have 3 seconds ago. And so how within the sort of evaluation of candidates, how do you see the impact of co-pilots on that fact and that question of what's the sort of honest knowledge of the candidate at any specific moment in time?
Yeah, so I guess kind of stepping back from it, talking about the point to kind of co-pilots, absolutely. I think everything is open. Right. I think right now we've had such a significant disruption that pretty much opens up, I think, every product category, every industry. Yeah, it's those age olds. I often meet early stage founders who go struggling to come up with an idea. All the ideas seem like they're taken. I mean, I tell them now with this wave, everything is open again. Right. Every thing is now open for disruption, whether it's co-pilots, personal assistants. There's definitely a way to now solve those problems differently, more efficiently, more effectively. And so I definitely do see we're going to get co-pilots or of that ilk for different use cases. And then I think it's the content. We call this, one of our operating principles, again, is ethical enlightenment. So it really is making sure ethics is at the kind of front and center, especially from a learning and knowledge context, because what we have here is a real opportunity to drive inclusion in the way we drive learning and development with AI. Right? Because what we're able to do now is really precisely personalize what learning every individual needs. Like, for example, if you take things like coaching and mentoring, it's typically restricted because of budget reasons to your kind of executive C-suite. Right? What we're going to be able to do now is essentially put an AI mentor in the hands of every single employee. Right? That does a lot for driving inclusion and offering, democratizing access to that level of knowledge and skill support. And it's huge for that. Now, in terms of the assessment of skills, this is why, going back to my point around objective versus subjective skills assessment, fundamentally, whether you're performing well or not is based on your benchmark and what you think good is like within an organization. And that's why our philosophy is we're not going to get to a situation of an objective assessment of performance, because what in your company you might think is good performance might vary to another company and how they measure performance and what ideals they want to take into account. So what it will come down to is organizational context, right? Is that, and that is where the opportunity is right now, right? We talk about ChatGPT being, the fastest growing product of all time, but that's exciting because actually ChatGPT knows nothing about you, right? It only knows what you tell it in its prompt, right? And if you're not giving it enough organizational context and you're not saying enough about yourself, now imagine a scenario where all of that context is there in memory, right? I know your organization. I know what the culture and value of your organization is. I know what your OKRs are. I know what you consider as good performance versus bad performance based on data I'm getting from your project management tool, your performance management tool. So I can now understand the mechanics and ways of working in your organization. And that will dictate how I assess good performance and bad performance. And I think that's what's exciting here is that context, right? And getting models trained on your organizational context. And that's where we're seeing the challenges, right? There's challenges around privacy. There's challenges around bias. There's challenges around data security. And I think these are the challenges for us to overcome. But I think I'm quite the optimist when it comes there. These are all, I think, solvable challenges, and we can overcome these. And where we land once we overcome these is an exciting place where, if I can have an AI mentor that's trained on organizational context and knows everything about where my strengths and weaknesses are from a skills perspective, there's an exciting horizon there.
Nelson, I'm going to bring a slightly different perspective to this. I'd love your views, and not only as the proponent, as HowNow, as a thought leader in the kind of space. And we started with this idea that the rate of change is exponential, which I think it is, and the difficulty of forecasting what exponential change looks like over term. All the resources that are flowing into AI, and the size of the prize on the other side of it. I mean, we're really trying to put intelligence into silica for the first time. It's probably the most valuable commodity on earth. And as you talk, I just feel this inexorable march towards a conclusion we're not discussing, which is that the co-pilot becomes the no pilot. So, I don't see what arrests the process from having a hyper-personalized system that can determine exactly what my deficiencies are in a particular situational context and serve me just a bit of information I need to perform, to eventually saying, well, I don't actually need that little bit of wetware to perform at all. Where do you see the brakes on that? And now I'm not asking you from the perspective of HowNow CEO, but just the march towards a future of AI mass proliferation. We kind of concede that we're building towards something that will understand context so well to know where our deficiencies are and serve up exactly the remedy that the application been learning. What is the handbrake that arrests that from also being the solver of the problem, disintermediating the human?
Yeah, and that will happen, Tim. And I think what's taken a lot of people by surprise historically, when we've spoken about AI replacing jobs, we've associated this with quote unquote low skilled jobs where people often, the imagery was manufacturing plants and robots going around, etc. But actually in reality, we can see in this first wave of generative AI, who would have thought programmers, right, and coders were the ones who you're now looking at going, actually your junior programmer, is there a job for that person? And you would have never had that discussion, because actually 5 years back, people were like, let's start learning programming. Everyone should be learning programming languages. But actually, the thing that it's able to do quite effectively is write decent code. And that's only getting better. And so absolutely, there are parts of this where that last mile, let's call it the AI last mile, where, well, why serve up the knowledge when I can apply that knowledge myself and do it? But again, this is where my belief is it will push the demands of what we expect from humans and how they contribute into a higher terrain, right? Like there are, much is said about the idea of from analytical to creativity. And I think we're still trying to figure this out. It's like with any shift, we're trying to see where is our place in this world. But it does make me laugh when, I saw when ChatGPT first came out, I saw a Twitter thread where they were like, do we need founders anymore? Could AI just found businesses? And I wouldn't go that far. And I think we're still trying to figure out where our place and our role is. But without a doubt, there is a role for us to shape this and make sure, even now, you do need founders to figure out how all of these different co-pilots are going to solve different problems around the world. Right. And I think at every point, we're trying to figure out our identity and our role here. And yeah, I wouldn't claim to say I had the answer for what that role is going to be. Is my founder role going to be
time.
Yeah, and I think it's that open-mindedness again, going back to there's exponential change and organizations being able to build the muscle to learn at speed within their company. One of the key fundamental mindsets there is that open mind, right? Is do we have the openness to go, okay, we don't know yet. And this is where one of the skills that organizations need to build is ambiguity tolerance, right? Is right now with exponential change, there's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of unknown, right? Right now, we're creating hypotheses around what AI can do. That in itself tells us there's a lot of ambiguity, a lot of uncertainty. And one of the key fundamental skills humans need right now is the ability to tolerate ambiguity. Because if not, we feel stressed, or we shut off. Right, we go, no, this is not going to affect us. And, that's when you get people who are your naysayers go, no, it's not going to change anything. The people who said internet wouldn't change anything, mobile wouldn't change. It's that. It stems from that ambiguity intolerance. And so I think it's important for us to have that level of tolerance for ambiguity so we can engage in this and find where our role is in this changing world.
And I think to be able to see the endless possibility and excitement in that ambiguity is absolutely key in being able to engage with that space in a way that doesn't just terrify you, because people do like to have their boundaries. This is, Nelson, it's been an absolutely fascinating conversation. I've got one final parting question just to get your views on. It seems to me there are two broad camps, two broad schools of thought in the AI, let's call it progression debate. The one reminds me of the gradualist evolution model, which is sort of an incremental change, much as it's always been. This is the next industrial revolution. And I'd paraphrase it by all of the proponents of this saying that an AI won't replace you, but a human with an AI will. That would be camp one. Camp two is probably a little bit more alarmist, and I've read a lot of the sort of professional prognosticators about what might happen, and obviously we've all listened to all of the luminaries in the space, but this is really a second proposition that says there will be something like 400 million jobs completely lost to the system over the next 5 years. McKinsey's put out an article saying the same. The United Nations has estimated 47% of all white-collar jobs in the US over the next little while. And this is the model of stochastic evolution, where you've suddenly taken a major jump forward. And we hopelessly underestimated the impact. And in this scenario, the jobs that were being done, the productivity that was being produced in the system remains, but it's no longer done by 400,000, 4 million, whatever you're going to scale it out to be globally. Yeah. And we find ourselves in a place of redistribution, like an urgent social political imperative to start engaging with how that redistribution is going to work and build potentially some protections to society to stop this all being shored up by the big tech, who kind of potentially hold not only the technology that empowered, but also possibly the regulatory capture that tends to go around big tech. So if I were to force you into a decision, where are you in camps 1 or 2? Do you think this is a gradual moment, sort of proposition 1, or do you think this is more of a proposition 2, a really disruptive next phase for humanity?
I'm probably somewhere in the middle, Tim, because I think
I thought you might say that.
it goes without saying, like, having been working with AI for the last decade, right, and looking at how machine learning has basically gone from the equivalent of a human with a very short attention span who can only remember one thing at a time, to now having a human who's got an incredible attention span and a memory that's able to, at exponential rate, remember more and more things. And just looking at every time someone like OpenAI puts out, launches a new update to what they're bringing out, and just seeing how far we can go so quickly. But what is just as interesting is how humans have been able to adopt and adapt and imagine possibilities of how to use AI. And that is also credit. That means we are building the right skills, maybe not enough people. And that's the question where we need to look at. But, it's incredible to see already the number of applications of generative AI in a meaningful way. That means humans are reacting to this exponential change in a meaningful way and are able to adapt and adopt and apply these technologies. And that shouldn't be discredited in these conversations around, is AI going to replace all humans, etc. But I think it does come back to where we kind of started from, this kind of upskilling, reskilling, and the importance of learning and development within the organization, because we now do have both a responsibility and a kind of have to answer the question around, okay, if AI is now going to do this, how do we use this human potential? What are the other things? And there are other things. And I'll give you a statistic to kind of finish on, is the US labor market published research that says right now there is 6 open roles for every qualified human who could do that job, right? Now, what that says is there's more job opportunity out there than there are people with the right skills to do those jobs. And so often when we read about these headlines saying how many jobs are going to be lost as a result of AI, what we're not also looking at is, and World Economic Forum recently published response around how many new jobs are going to be created. And there's significant jobs that we didn't even know existed now exist. And so the biggest imperative as a community, society, government is to look at, there are skills that are massively in demand and we're short of people with those skills. So how are we going to upskill and reskill these people to get to that point? And that's why I'm somewhere in the middle, because there are some of these challenges we can address to be able to make sure we don't end up with a large segment of the population socially and economically irrelevant, because that is a concern and that is a danger and that does worry me, and it should worry all of us. And so the question is really, are we doing everything we can from both an individual, organizational and government perspective is where we look at. So it's a optimist with a hint of paranoia, Tim.
I think that's a wonderful answer and a fantastic place to end. And it just absolutely, for me, reaffirms how much of the right track you are on. Even if you think about the big social moments right now, the fact that we need more AI regulators and people moving into that industry to understand how we're going to contain and harness this and ensure that we have the best possible outcomes in society and in business, it really just reinforces the message that you have of making sure that the application of knowledge is fit for the moment. It's been an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. We've really enjoyed the conversation.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on the show.